Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm back with day number 3 using the Simon Says stamp card kit for October 2018. I am starting off using my Misty here, and I'm using this large stamp again because I can't get enough of it. And I'm going to be stamping this on 2 different panels. Now the first one, I didn't get a good impression, so I end up just throwing that one away. I don't have the creative corners for Misty, so, and this is a huge stamp that kind of hangs over. So I'm just kind of lining it up the best I can. For this particular card, it does not need to be perfect, but you'll see here that if I don't get a good impression, I can't really stamp it again. So I tossed that one, got a new piece, and used my magnet this time like I should have the first time. And I'm stamping this with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. This is Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And like I said, I just stamped this on 2 separate panels, both pretty much the same way. And it does not have to be exact because we're going to be cutting these down in the end. Once my stamping was down, I moved on to just one of these panels, and I'm using antique linen. This is regular distress ink. I'm not doing any masking. I'm going right over my image here and starting off right in the center of my image and kind of working my way out to the white, leaving the corners still white. This is such a light color that you can get away with doing this without adding any additional color of distress ink. And again, I'm only doing this with one panel. Next, we'll move on to the Copic Coloring. And for this panel here that we did not add the distress ink, I'm only coloring this flower. So I'm starting off with my lightest color here and mapping out my darkest areas, which will be on the base of each of those petals where they're kind of meeting in the center or lying on top of one another. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and just lay out my very darkest areas. This will be basically where my shadows are. And those lines within the illustration or within the stamp, I'm kind of using those as a guide as well. So some of them are varying lengths. So for my flicks, I'm also doing varying lengths. Next, I'll move on to my darkest mid-tone and extend those flicks out just a little bit. And then go in with my lightest mid-tone and then back in with my lightest color. You also want to make sure that you're creating a shadow where those little petals are folded over on themselves. This would naturally be a darker area on these flowers. Now, this color that I ended up with for the flower, I'm going to end up changing it a little bit later. Like I always say, you can always go back and make it darker. You cannot make it lighter without making it look muddy. So later on, you'll see that I wasn't really happy with the color of the flower, and I'll go back in later and add a little bit more color. I also noticed here that when I added my lighter color here, I lost a lot of those shadows and kind of picked it up. Sometimes that will happen with alcohol markers. So I just went back in with my darkest color and just added a few of those shadows back in. And sometimes you don't even have to blend these back out. Just adding these darker areas right there in the base of these petals is usually enough. So for the panel that we did the distress ink on, I'm just taking one of these colors. I think this is one of the mid-tone colors. And I'm just coloring the tips of the petals. You're not going to end up seeing this flower. It's going to be popped up. But this is just to kind of cover up the areas just in case you kind of peek underneath the foam tape. You won't see just plain white. Next, we'll move on to the main panel here with the distress ink. And I'm going to speed this up quite a bit because if you've watched either of the 2 previous videos, you know pretty much where my shading is going to be. This is mainly just to show you the color combinations that I'm using. I'm using 3 and 4 color blends depending on the flower. I'm kind of sticking to fall colors here, so oranges and golden colors and yellows. With the exception of the leaves, I will color those green. So for these little squiggly flowers here, there's 2 of them, coloring them the same way. This is kind of like a golden yellow combination. I always start with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas, just in case I make a mistake. Covering up a lighter color is a lot easier than covering up a dark color. There's also these two other little squiggly flowers here that are very similar, and I'll color those pretty much the same way as I did for the first two. I'm just using different color combinations here. For these ones, there's going to be a shadow where they're laying underneath this main flower. Well, I'm calling it the main flower because it's my favorite one out of the stamp. But so you want to make sure that you're leaving a darker area there. Anytime one object is laying over another, it's naturally going to be darker. Anything in the background is going to be darker. So just keep that in mind, that anything that's laying behind something is going to have a smaller highlight and a larger shadow. Now for these next flowers, like I said, these are very similar to these other ones that we colored kind of like this golden yellow color. This time, instead of putting my shadow on the inside of the petal, I'm putting it on the outside of the petal. Again, starting off with my lightest color, doing the same thing as I've been doing this entire time. These are such tiny little areas that you can really get away with probably just two colors here, but I did use three. I think I may have used four, but I think I only used three. And honestly, it didn't really make too much of a difference. As long as you have some sort of variation in colors or tones in there, it'll look just fine. For the centers, I didn't really worry about too much shading there. I just used two colors and just made the bottoms of them a little bit darker. No really rhyme or reason for this shading whatsoever. Now for this next flower here, my darkest color is going to be an E marker. And I'm just concentrating the darkest areas, again, being in the middle of the flower where the petals all kind of meet in the middle. And once again, once my flower was completely colored, I didn't really like the contrast that I got. So I did go back in with my darkest color, that E33, which is really not all that dark, and just added those shadow colors again, just to give it a little bit more contrast. Now for the leaves, we'll start off with these larger leaves. I'm going to be using my YG 90 markers, and I'm going to concentrate my darkest areas where the leaf meets the stem. So I'm just flicking out a little bit of my dark color, again, creating that shadow on that one leaf that's lying underneath that one flower. Once I had my lightest color down, again, wasn't happy with the contrast, went in with a YG 99 and just added a little bit of darkness to those center areas of the leaves. Now for these next leaves, I'm going to concentrate my darkest area being on either side of the leaf. So it will make it look like it's kind of bowed out a little bit, leaving that highlight right there in the center. For these larger buds here, I'm going to go back to the same colors that we used for that first flower that we colored, the main flower as I'm calling it. And I'm just laying out my darkest areas just a little bit right there where these little buds meet the stem, blending that out with the mid-tone, and then just leaving a very small highlight on the very tips of them. For these other little buds or berries, I'm really not sure what these are. I'm not doing any kind of shading. They're really teeny tiny. No shading is necessary for this, so I'm just going in with just one color here and just filling in those areas. Now, once all of my coloring was done, I took that one panel there that we had colored just that one flower, and I'm going to fussy cut this out. I'm not leaving any border on this. I'm cutting right along the black line. And once my cutting was done, I didn't want there to be any kind of white border at all, and I don't cut perfectly. So I take a water-based marker, and you can use, I know Memento makes one. This is actually a Stampin' Up! One. I don't know where it came from, but it does have a brush tip to it, and that I find the easiest. I go right along the edges from the back of the flower. If your marker slips and you're working on the front, then you just ruined your image. So you'd have to do it all over again. So I always work from the back. Now for my sentiment, I was playing around with this a little bit. I didn't really want it to go over my image because the lines or the writing on these sentiments are pretty thin. I felt like it wasn't really going to show up if I went over my image at all. So I ended up stamping this with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there in the bottom left-hand corner. That way it really wouldn't overlap too much. Now for this flower, this is, as I'm looking at it now, I'm really not liking the color. It's a little bit too bright. I wanted these to be fall flowers, and this was just too bright and vibrant. So I went back in with those same colors that I used initially. I just left out the highlight color, and I just extended my shadows a little bit further than what they were before. Extended that out with my darkest mid-tone color, again, just a little bit further than I did before, and leaving out that highlight color. I was much happier with the results. It was much darker color that I ended up with, and it matched the rest of the floral spray that I had colored. Next, I decided to add a cast shadow. My panel was looking a little bit flat, so I'm using my warm gray markers here. Normally when I do any kind of shadowing at all, I use my cool grays, but these are all just such warm colors that I wanted to kind of stick with that. So I'm going right in with my darkest color here, which is the W5, and I'm just concentrating my shadowing being to the bottom left, and I'm not even casting a shadow on every single image, especially this middle image. Being it is going to be popped up, it's going to cast its own shadow. So I'm just doing some of these images, not really too worried about being perfect. Once I had my darkest color down, I moved on to my W3, extended those lines out a little bit further, and then finally go in with my W1 and extend those out even further. Now, because I stamped my sentiment with the VersaFine ink, this is not Copic safe. So if you're using any kind of Copic markers or alcohol markers over that, you just want to be really careful to try to avoid going directly over the ink, or else it will smear. Next, I am using Scotch foam tape and cutting this in little tiny pieces and sticking this to the back of my main flower here, and I'll pop that right over top of the flat image, I guess. And this is where, if you peek underneath, you won't see any of that white, being we colored the tips of the petals. Last, I added just a few clear Nuvo drops, a couple on the top and a couple right above that sentiment. And I adhered this to an A2 size card base, and that is it for this card today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.